For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled the night. With that effortless grin, the cool laugh, and the sharp wit that could turn silence into thunderous applause, he became the most trusted man on television. But what America never saw was the tension behind that smile, the moments when charm gave way to contempt. Because behind the curtain, there were guests Carson couldn't stand. Some irritated him with arrogance, others betrayed his trust, and a few simply pushed his patience to its breaking point. He never showed it on air. Not once. Yet producers, writers, and lifelong friends would later admit Carson's calm wasn't always kindness, it was control, a mask he perfected to survive the chaos of celebrity. Over thousands of interviews, he faced them all: legends, eccentrics, drunk storytellers, and self-promoting stars who forgot whose stage they were on. And when the cameras stopped rolling, he often sigh, light a cigarette, and mutter, "Never again." These are the 10 guests who pushed Johnny Carson too far, the ones who turned late-night laughter into silent fury. Number 1. Joan Rivers. Of all the guests who ever sat beside Johnny Carson, none cut deeper than Joan Rivers. She wasn't just another comedian fighting for airtime, she was his discovery, his chosen successor, and one of the few he genuinely admired. For 2 decades, she had been part of his Tonight Show family, a regular guest who understood his timing, his humor, and his need for control. Carson gave her the biggest break of her life, and he told her once, in front of millions, "You're going to be a star." But by 1986, that admiration shattered. Fox had just launched a new late-night show to rival NBC, and when Joan accepted the job without telling him, Carson felt blindsided. He didn't hear it from her, not even a phone call. He heard it from the press. To him, it wasn't business. It was betrayal. Overnight, he banned her from The Tonight Show, a decision so final that she would not appear again until after his death nearly 30 years later. Rivers later admitted she'd wanted his blessing but feared his reaction. Carson never forgave her. Friends said he refused even to hear her name. When her husband Edgar later died, Carson didn't call, didn't send a note. It wasn't anger anymore. It was absence. Behind the charm, Johnny had one unspoken rule. Loyalty was sacred. Rivers broke that rule, and it ended not just a friendship, but an era. The audience saw smiles, but the man behind the desk saw betrayal, broadcast live. For the rest of his life, when people mentioned her, he simply looked down, took a sip of coffee, and changed the subject. For Johnny Carson, silence was always the loudest answer. Number 2. Bob Hope. To the public, Bob Hope and Johnny Carson represented 2 sides of the same American coin. Both were quick-witted, patriotic, and masters of timing. When Hope appeared on The Tonight Show, viewers saw 2 comedy giants trading jokes. But behind the scenes, Carson dreaded those nights. What once felt like camaraderie had turned into obligation. By the late 1970s, Carson had grown tired of Hope's predictable appearances. Hope never truly talked. He performed. Every line was scripted, every response rehearsed. His assistant would hand Carson a sheet of jokes before taping, telling him which topics to cue so Hope could deliver punchlines he'd been using for months. It stripped away everything Carson valued about real conversation. He wanted spontaneity, honesty, and rhythm, not a routine. Writers from The Tonight Show later revealed that Carson began rolling his eyes the moment Hope's name appeared on the guest list. During commercial breaks, he would slump in his chair, sighing that Hope doesn't listen to a word anyone says. What had once been respect for a pioneer turned into quiet frustration. Hope's presence demanded deference. He arrived late, interrupted rehearsals, and expected the studio to bend around him. Still, Carson never showed it publicly. He smiled, laughed, and pretended the chemistry was natural, but his patience thinned each year as Hope's material grew stale. When the cameras went off, the grin vanished instantly. Crew members recalled Carson mumbling that Hope hadn't been funny since Eisenhower. Their friendship faded, never formally ending, but eroding through routine politeness. Hope saw Carson as a successor. Carson saw Hope as a shadow of what comedy used to be. What once connected them, timing, professionalism, and pride, became the wall that divided them. In an industry built on laughter, Johnny Carson learned that not all legends age gracefully. Some outlive their magic, and the hardest part is pretending not to notice. Number 3. Wayne Newton. Few guests ever rattled Johnny Carson, but Wayne Newton did more than that. He made him furious. What began as harmless late-night humor turned into one of Carson's few public feuds, a conflict that never truly healed. It started in the early 1980s, when Carson made a string of jokes about Newton's appearance and masculinity. The gags were meant to be playful, but Newton saw them as cruel, rooted in something deeper than comedy. Newton, already fighting tabloid rumors and criticism over his Las Vegas persona, reached his breaking point. According to accounts from studio staff, he showed up unannounced at The Tonight Show offices and demanded to see Carson face to face. The confrontation was brief, tense, and unforgettable. Newton reportedly told him, "You ever say that again, I'll kick your expletive." For once, Carson had no punchline. The feud became legendary. Newton refused to appear on The Tonight Show again, and Carson never mentioned his name afterward. Privately, Carson told writers he'd touched a nerve and wanted the whole matter buried. But for Newton, it was personal. He later called Carson a mean-spirited man who used his platform to hurt people. The words stung because they came from someone who, like Carson, had built a career on stage charm masking exhaustion. Their silent war lasted decades. Even after Carson's retirement, Newton never softened. He told interviewers that forgiveness wasn't necessary because you can't forgive someone who never cared. For Carson, the episode was a reminder that every joke had a target, and sometimes the target shot back. Behind the laughter, the feud revealed a truth about late-night television. The host may control the camera, but not the consequences. For Johnny Carson, Wayne Newton was the one guest who proved that comedy could cut too deep. Number 4. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was the kind of guest producers loved, and Johnny Carson quietly dreaded. Brilliant, volatile, and completely unpredictable, she could steal an interview within seconds. Some nights she was charming and nostalgic, reminiscing about her Oscar wins and old Hollywood romances. Other nights she was combative, talking over Carson, interrupting other guests, or veering into stories that had nothing to do with the questions he asked. One of her most infamous appearances came in the early 1970s. Carson mentioned Marlon Brando in passing, and Winters, who had once dated him, launched into an unfiltered tirade about his ego, Hollywood hypocrisy, and men who can't handle strong women. Halfway through, she pulled a bottle of wine out of her purse and poured herself a drink on the desk. The audience roared. Carson didn't. He stared, half amused, half horrified, watching his carefully timed show dissolve into chaos. After that night, producers warned him she'd been drinking backstage, and Carson reportedly told them, "No more surprises." But she kept coming back, because unpredictable television got ratings. Each time he smiled through the storm, letting her talk, his fingers drumming on the desk whenever she wouldn't stop. Off camera, the crew knew that Winters represented everything Carson struggled with: loss of control. He admired her talent but despised her unpredictability. To him, The Tonight Show was a symphony of rhythm and restraint. Shelley was a trumpet that refused to play in tune. Years later, when asked about her, Carson kept it brief. "She was something else," he said, trailing off with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. For Johnny Carson, Shelley Winters wasn't just a difficult guest. She was a reminder that live television could expose every crack in the armor of even the calmest host. Number 5. Don Rickles. Johnny Carson and Don Rickles were close friends for decades. But that friendship lived in a strange balance between affection and irritation. On camera, Rickles' sharp tongue was comedy gold, the master of insult humor throwing jabs at the king of late night. The audience loved it. Carson played the perfect straight man, smirking while Rickles tore into him. But what viewers didn't see was how often the jokes cut closer to the bone than anyone realized. Rickles thrived on pushing limits. He mocked Carson's divorces, his drinking, even his aloofness with guests. The barbs were supposed to be harmless, yet there were nights when Carson's polite laugh turned into a tight smile. Writers said they could tell when Rickles had gone too far. Carson's eyes would drop, his fingers would tap the desk, and he'd steer the show toward commercial faster than usual. The most famous incident came in 1976, when Rickles accidentally broke Carson's prized cigarette box while guest hosting. The next night, Carson barged onto the set of Rickles' own show, CPO Sharkey, mid-taping, demanding, "You broke my box." The audience roared, but behind the laughter was genuine irritation. For Carson, it wasn't about the box, it was about control. Off stage, they patched things up, but the friendship always carried that edge. Carson respected Rickles' sip's brilliance, but resented his unpredictability. In private, he once called Rickles the only man alive who can make me angry and laugh at the same time. When Carson retired in 1992, Rickles sent a heartfelt message calling him the best straight man I ever had. Carson never replied, but he kept a photo of them on his office shelf. Rickles mid-laugh, Carson half-smiling. Their bond was built on tension. Two men who loved the spotlight but lived in different ways inside it. For Johnny Carson, Don Rickles was both a reminder of friendship and the cost of being the punchline everyone expected you to take. Number 6. Angie Dickinson. Angie Dickinson was one of those guests who could turn the temperature of a room just by walking in. Beautiful, confident, and perfectly aware of both. She had an energy that made live television unpredictable. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, viewers saw charm and playful banter, but behind Carson's smooth delivery was unease. Their chemistry looked effortless on screen, yet it carried a tension he never liked. Dickinson had been one of Hollywood's most desired leading ladies, often cast opposite men like Frank Sinatra and Burt Reynolds. She knew how to flirt for the camera, and she did it naturally, teasing Carson, leaning in too close, and joking about his reputation with women. The audience laughed, but Carson didn't always find it funny. He valued control above everything, and Dickinson's presence made him feel exposed. The lines between host and subject blurred, turning interviews into subtle power struggles. Producers later admitted that Carson grew increasingly uncomfortable booking her. Off-air, he described her as a hurricane in heels, unpredictable and too quick to challenge his authority with a smile. During one appearance in the early 1980s, Dickinson interrupted him mid-question and joked, "You don't want answers, Johnny, you want applause." The crowd erupted. Carson froze, smiled thinly, and moved to commercial. It wasn't anger, exactly, more like irritation wrapped in restraint. He respected her talent but didn't trust her tone. Unlike other guests, she didn't cater to his rhythm. She disrupted it, intentionally or not. After that, Dickinson appeared only a handful more times, their playful spark replaced with polite distance. Years later, she would speak fondly of him, calling him mysterious and shy. But Carson, when asked about her, simply said, "She was good television." For a man who measured every word, that was both a compliment and a warning. Angie Dickinson had done what few could, made Johnny Carson uncomfortable on his own stage. Number 7. Charles Grodin. Charles Grodin was unlike any guest Johnny Carson ever had. He didn't try to please the host, didn't chase the audience's approval, and often appeared to dislike being there at all. That was the joke, but not everyone found it funny. Grodin's dry, combative style became his trademark. and on The Tonight Show it created moments that walked a razor's edge between comedy and discomfort. From his first appearance in the 1970s, Grodin made it clear he wasn't there to play along. When Carson asked him about his latest film, Grodin might respond with a bored shrug, or a cutting remark about how no one really cares about that, Johnny. The crowd would howl, unsure if it was a bit or a breakdown. Carson meanwhile kept his cool, but behind the smile he wasn't amused. Writers and crew members later admitted that Carson often didn't know whether Grodin was serious or just staying in character. During one particularly tense exchange, Grodin accused Carson of interrupting too much and grabbed his cue cards off the desk. Carson laughed, but his jaw tightened. After the show, he reportedly told producers, "If he ever pulls that again, he's finished." Still, the strange chemistry worked. Grodin became a recurring guest precisely because viewers couldn't look away. The tension between the two men became its own kind of performance. Carson's poise against Grodin's deadpan rebellion. Some nights they looked like old friends sparring for fun. Other nights, it felt like genuine resentment spilling into the airwaves. Over time, Carson learned to respect Grodin's Seps method, even if he never enjoyed it. "Hus Seps dangerous," one staffer remembered him saying, "because you never know which version you Seps are getting." When Grodin later reflected on their relationship, he said he admired Carson for playing along longer than anyone else would have. For Johnny Carson, Charles Grodin was the guest who proved that even mastery has limits. That control, once cracked, can still make for unforgettable television. Number 8. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra wasn't just another guest, he was an event. When Old Blue Eyes appeared on The Tonight Show, the studio transformed, security tripled, producers rehearsed every cue, and Carson's crew knew one rule: nothing goes wrong when Frank's in the building. But behind the polished smiles and applause, Johnny Carson had little patience for Sinatra's entitlement. Sinatra traveled with an entourage that treated every studio like their own living room. Assistants, publicists, and bodyguards swarmed the set, rearranging furniture, dictating camera angles, even telling producers where Frank would sit. Carson, a man obsessed with timing and order, found it infuriating. He once joked privately that the only person harder to book than Sinatra was the Pope. Their on-air conversations were polite but shallow. Sinatra dominated every exchange, interrupting, telling long, self-congratulatory stories, and rarely allowing Carson to guide the rhythm. Johnny's laugh was courteous, but his eyes told a different story, amusement mixed with irritation. He respected Sinatra's legend, yet disliked how the man carried it like a weapon. Crew members recalled how Carson would retreat to his dressing room immediately after taping, muttering that Frank never learned the difference between charm and power. The resentment deepened when Sinatra began canceling appearances at the last minute or showing up late, leaving producers scrambling to fill airtime. And yet, Carson never confronted him. He couldn't. Sinatra was too big, too untouchable. The price of hosting America's biggest show was learning to bow without looking like you'd bent. Still, Carson's restraint said everything. He invited Sinatra less and less as the years went on, choosing newer, easier guests instead. To the public, they were legends sharing the stage. But to those who worked behind it, the tension was clear. Johnny Carson admired Sinatra's voice, but not his presence. For a man who built his career on grace, the one guest he couldn't stand was the one who demanded it from everyone else. Number 9. Dean Martin. Dean Martin was one of the few entertainers who could rival Johnny Carson's charm. Cool, funny, and effortlessly likable, he walked onto the Tonight Show stage as though he owned it. The public saw an old-school friendship between two icons, full of laughter and martini-fueled nostalgia. But behind the scenes, Carson's admiration for Martin often came with a sigh. The problem wasn't malice, it was unpredictability. Dean rarely took interviews seriously. He'd show up late, sometimes clearly buzzed, and derail entire segments with jokes that wandered nowhere. His easygoing style made for good television, but it clashed with Carson's precise sense of rhythm. For Carson, every interview was a dance. For Martin, it was a game. One appearance in the late 1970s stood out. Martin slurred through a story about Sinatra, then turned to Carson and said, "You know, Johnny, I only come here for the free booze." The audience roared. Carson forced a laugh, but the tension was visible. After the show, he told a producer, "He doesn't even know where he is half the time." Yet Carson couldn't fully dislike Martin. Part of him envied how easily Dean seemed to live, how little he cared about rules or reputations. Carson's control was his armor, Martin's looseness was his freedom, and that difference created friction that never quite went away. Still, there was respect. Carson once said offhandedly that Dean Martin never pretends to be something he isn't, a rare compliment from a man who distrusted most of Hollywood. But even that came with a trace of weariness. Martin's charm could carry him through anything, while Carson's perfectionism only left him tired. By the 80s, Martin's appearances grew fewer. When he did return, Carson greeted him warmly, but with distance, as though both men knew their eras were ending. To America, they were legends laughing together. To Carson, Dean Martin was a mirror he didn't always want to face, the man who made chaos look easy. For 3 decades, he sat beneath the lights, smiling through chaos. The world saw charm, grace, and perfect timing. But inside that calm exterior lived a man who measured every moment, every pause, every laugh. Hosting was never just a job. It was a balancing act between patience and power, and some nights that balance wavered. Television in those years wasn't scripted perfection. It was unpredictable, human, and often exhausting. Each guest brought their own storms, and his role was to make it all look effortless. But beneath the laughter there were boundaries, invisible lines that separated professionalism from pride, tolerance from resentment. When those lines were crossed, he never lashed out, he simply shut down, retreating behind that famous half-smile that told his crew more than words ever could. In the end, what made him remarkable wasn't how he handled the people he liked, but how he survived the ones he didn't. Every awkward silence, every forced laugh, every swallowed insult became part of the legend. The audience saw laughter. But what truly defined him was restraint, the quiet mastery of a man who knew that in television, the strongest emotion is the one you never show. For more emotional stories, check out this video.